Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the sorta new album from Actress, Statik. Okay, so I'm a bit late to this one, but we're not typically too bothered about timeliness on this channel, right? Anyway, we're here to talk more about the work of critically acclaimed UK producer Darren Cunningham, aka Actress, back again with another new album that came out this past June, only about half a year after his previous album 88 came out the prior November. You can find the Some Stuff I Missed segment I did on his last album, including a mini and brief segment going through all his other old albums, linked in the description. Now, I'll admit I only got to this album now thanks to the fact that I'd initially planned on including it in the lineup of the next Some Stuff I Missed roundup, which I've started writing. However, in the process of writing that segment, I also decided on a whim to re-listen to his old albums again, and I started to realize this guy's the kind of artist that, in order for me to fully do justice, I'd need to highlight him in a proper discography review someday. Even if I don't necessarily plan to do that in the near future. It had me thinking I should really be dedicating full videos to this guy's work instead of digesting it more passively for smaller segments. Thing about Actress is that if one is to listen to his music more passively, chances are you're not going to get too much out of it. He's not one to give listeners that much to latch onto on the surface level. His mixes of lots of different elements from techno, ambient, instrumental, hip-hop, garage, and plenty more are always extremely subtle, often intentionally crafted to feel very muted and gray and downbeat and maybe even drab. If people say they don't care for his music because they find him boring, that does make perfect sense to me. This is not an artist capable of getting the party started. He's for solitary headphone listening only. But there's always a lot going on beneath the surface if you're able to really sit up and pay attention to it. He has a particular way of putting really subtle but intriguing twists on all these standard electronic formulas and frameworks. All the elements in an Actress production will be familiar for any regular listener of electronic music, but the way they're assembled never plays any formula straight, and the way he does it isn't quite comparable to any other artist out there. Early Boards of Canada is close, Replica era One Tricks Point Never is close, Burial and Andy Stoddard kind of along similar lines, but none of those comparison points quite hit upon his style either. Only Actress sounds like Actress. And I mean, the fact that he appeals to music writer types in particular was really easy for me to grasp from the first time I sat through his catalog, because there is just something innately interesting about this guy that couldn't quite be put into words. His music makes for an interesting challenge to write about. Now, getting to this newest album, Statik, as mentioned, it's an unusually fast turnaround from his last effort, which was only about half a year before that. Not to mention, this album marks him switching labels from his usual home on Ninja Tune over to Small Town Supersound, the label best known for hosting the likes of Kelly Lee Owens and Lindstrom. Now, that left me not sure what to expect. While his last album did apparently get more mixed reviews from fans, I personally really liked it and thought it delivered more of what I found so striking about his work, with a couple of my new favorite tracks of his, such as Push Power, even though it wasn't among his most inventive albums and didn't really try to offer any new ideas that he hadn't already done before. This one seemed to get a bit more enthusiasm from fans, so yeah, I finally jumped into Statik to see what we got, hoping for the best, and boy did I pick a heck of a challenging album to start dedicating full videos on this guy to. So, Statik is notable for probably being his most ambient-centric work up to this point. The title apparently comes from his wanting to create this sense of stillness, making these mixes, of course, feel very static and unmoving on the surface. Even by the standards of this artist who's never been in your face about anything, this might beat out his 2014 album Ghettoville as his most subtle and toned down effort yet. One can listen to this album several times and not be able to glean anything from it out of how still and muted and background music-y it is. I feel like my first 5 listens of this album nearly entirely went in one ear and out the other. Granted, that's not to say the material here is actually that static and unmoving. I mean, if one is to sit up and pay close attention to what's going on, they might be able to find that this album is actually constantly moving and progressing. Take the way this album starts with the 6-minute opener, Hell. At first, this cut just focuses on a flickering pad of white noise with a few barely present synth melodies sort of peeking through the bottom. Although those melodies start to take more of the focus, a crunchy and abstract set of fuzzy percussion elements is introduced. I hesitate to call it a beat because it's just very lumbering and doesn't really form a regular pulse. There's also a few incomprehensible and really lo-fi voice snippets. There's moments where the mix feels like it's being abruptly sped up and slowed down, or the key changes, as if a product of tape manipulation. And at the end, we get an actual beat introduced with a kind of halftime techno or IDM influence to it to give the track an actual pulse. If you're paying attention without watching where the track begins or ends, this cut could theoretically be perceived as like 5 different tracks in one, and yet all the sounds going into it are also so muted and low-key that it could just as easily be perceived as barely moving at all. An interesting paradox that is. After a 1.5-minute ambient interlude in the sorta title track, spelled slightly differently, that actually is very still and focuses on a single very monolithic pad that just barely sorts of waves up and down a bit. We then get a couple of tracks that have a bit more structure and make for much more striking standouts for me. The point at which this album starts to pull me in more effectively is My Ways, which is an even slightly shorter 1.5-minute interlude, but the musical elements going into it aren't nearly as formless or obscure. Just a simple loop of very pretty chiming keyboard melodies accentuated by a few more lo-fi audio snippets that sound more like someone singing to themselves in a public restroom, or a louder, more magnified sound of someone breathing and shifting around their clothes. And then after that we get possibly my favorite track here in Rainlines, arguably the least formless and most structured track on the album, which is least likely to fall into the background for me. I mean, it's still very subtle and toned down, a bunch of repeating chords of these kind of flute-like synths going over a very simple thumping techno beat and some fuzzy noise that resembles vinyl crackling in the background, also featuring a section where most of these elements briefly start to fall away and lose their form and then come back after that. But he is still able to form this defined hook out of all these very minimalistic elements, and in a way that always stuck out to me every listen I gave this thing. It's probably the track I can most easily remember what it sounds like. Following track Ray kinda directly carries off some similar ideas, but gives them more of a freewheeling and open-ended feel, with a bunch of pleasant and mildly lighthearted plinking synth melodies, with a couple of moaning voice snippets every now and then, just sort of echoing over another simple set of like a steady kick and marching hi-hats. Despite how different the vibe of this track is from the previous one and how defined the gap between them is, the similar tempo and kind of mirroring beatwork make this track kind of blend into Rainlines on many listens I gave this thing. It's also a track I would have thought had more progression than it did on some listens, because it does have more of a sense of movement and pulse, but the actual idea behind it doesn't really change over time. It's just like steadily walking through one location, like you're moving, but the scenery isn't changing. And the next track, 6, kind of carries off that track's idea, taking it to the next logical step. Another different beat moving at the same tempo, but even simpler, pretty much just a single tapping noise, which is kind of both a kick and a hi-hat at the same time, going over lots of floating, formless clouds of melodic pads, which are, again, very pretty and refreshing, and there's also lots of subtle white noise that feels like a light breeze passing through. That's really nice. Though, if this album has been running together for you, the next track, Cafe Del Mars, really starts to break away from the vibe the previous several tracks had set down. At first there's no beats at all, just a lot of formless, flanging choir-like pads that feel much darker and more unpleasant than the tracks leading up to it. Although some breezy mechanical percussion is introduced later, alongside a steady repeating arpeggio of muted bell synths, which gets more and more in focus the further into the track you get. Near the end, there's also like a little part with some odd glitchy noises, too. It's one of those tracks that starts in one place and ends somewhere unrelated that doesn't really resemble the starting point, and yet the progression from point A to point B is so linear you might not even notice the progression at all. And while this track may have lots of elements in common with most of the other tracks here, the sound of it feels very different from any other track. Like, the subtle flanging phase-shifting effect to some of the audio makes this whole track feel like I'm watching security cam footage of a gas station at night through an old CRT monitor. It's also the longest track in the bunch, but I wouldn't have even noticed that was the case if I didn't see it for myself. Admittedly, that track is not a major favorite, even if it was a lot more interesting as I really sat up and paid attention to what it was doing. Though the next track, Dolphin Spray, is able to stand out for me a bit more effectively. The percussion and pulse on this one is much better defined and in focus than most tracks here, and the way it evolves between all these high-pitched plinking arpeggios into these barely audible guitar-like melodies and going back and forth between them is really smooth. It's one of the nicer and more pleasant cuts here, and that's contrasted quite heavily by System Verse, which is arguably the album's darkest and most despondent moment. The first minute of the track is nothing but sub-bass rumbling alongside a one-note melodic wash or two that you might just barely be able to make out in the background, although other elements start to fade in and take more focus, like a set of pads floating through a descending progression of 3 chords, as well as some fuzzy audio artifacts and a tapping noise acting as percussion, kind of making like a loose, undefined polyrhythm with the sub-bass rumbling. Perhaps this is a bit of a cliched comparison point, but this track feels like one of those darker moments that would have showed up on Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, like specifically with some tracks like Tree or Curtains, or one of those. And that takes us to the album's ending. The penultimate cut, Doves Over Atlantis, makes for a sort of narrative climax of sorts for the album, despite being another one of the most ambient-centric cuts on display here. Again, no beats at all, just more clouds of ambient synth pads going up next to pure fuzzy white noise and barely audible pianos way in the background. They sort of come into a little focus for the last minute, but that's everything to it. Very little goes into the mix, but the melodic contents of the track feel more dramatic and emotionally involved than many other tracks here. So it definitely stands out in that way. And finally, we close with the similarly ambient Mellow Checx, which I think might be my second favorite track on the album. This is the album's most serene and dreamlike moment. At first, it's very minimalistic, with simple patterns of 4 descending electric piano notes and a wiry pad or two, but then fades into these more full-sounding moody chords on the same electric pianos that feel much nicer and more immersive. It's just really nice stuff. So, that's everything on Statik. I'm gonna be honest, this was a particularly odd album to quantify. In one breath, as always with this guy, the still waters do run deep, and there's just as much substance behind this album as anything else he's put out, even if absolutely none of it is easily gleaned from the surface. At the same time, the fact that all that substance is so far below the surface might not make it one of his easier projects to recommend to a lay listener. I don't know if I could say this stood apart as one of my favorite albums of his. In fact, it might actually be my least favorite album of his so far, although that is really not saying much. His catalog is very consistent. I just tend to prefer the albums of his that are easier to digest on that surface level, such as R.I.P. or AZD, projects that have more immediately striking or out-of-the-box ideas to convince me to sit up and pay more attention, instead of kind of already assuming I'll be doing that and possibly burying the lead too heavily. If I didn't already know Actress's reputation for this kind of subtlety, or it came from some artist I never heard of, if I had this in my Some Stuff I Miss lineup without having heard his earlier albums and already knowing the right kind of mindset required to digest this stuff, the lack of things to note on the surface level could have resulted in this album leaving so little impact on me that I might not have felt compelled to review it at all. But at the same time, the near-complete lack of easier accessibility here feels like a weird thing to complain about when the substance is still there as it always is, and there's still a feel to this album to set itself apart from other albums in his catalog. It still does everything I would want a new Actress album to do. Listening to this feels like watching some avant-garde art house horror film from the 50s or something. One that has a lot of long lingering shots on empty scenes and relies a lot on negative space. Maybe one that might still have a loose narrative structure, but you have to put in the mental work for it to fully make sense. Is this the kind of album that I see myself coming back to a lot over the rest of this year? Probably not. For me, it might have been the kind of album that was more fun to write about than it was necessarily to listen to, and I would get it if the extra mental effort required to really get into it wouldn't even be worth it for some people. But I still feel like his core fan base will definitely get plenty out of it, and if you are willing to put in the work, there are still more than enough compelling ideas and immersively moody and gray vibes that I did glean out of it to still give my thumbs up on this and be feeling like a 7.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.